Myra Brown is only 12 years old when her older cousin Jerry Lee shakes up her life.
We were all mesmerized. You knew something great was coming out of this.
And he rocks the rest of the world.
Goodness and gracious, great balls of fire!
It's the birth of rock and roll and the beginning of a roller coaster for Myra.
Jerry would kiss me. I mean, it was nice, but I was confused.
I think Jerry Lee was a predator, and Myra was an easy mark for him.
Jerry was so possessive of me, he did not want me to look another man in the eye.
He had a terrible temper, and then you combine it with amphetamines and booze, it's like pouring lighter fuel on a fire.
When the good times came back for Jerry's career, things went to hell quickly. My family moved to Memphis, Tennessee when I was 5 years old. And I cried all the way there because I wanted to stay with my mama.
It's 1949, and Myra Brown is saying goodbye to her extended family in rural Louisiana.
My daddy got a job as a lineman in Memphis.
Memphis, they say, is this sort of gateway into the Deep South. It really became this meeting point between white and black music, between country and early sort of rockabilly, hillbilly music, and African-American music, gospel and R&B. And the focal point for Memphis music at that time is Sam Phillips and Sun Records.
Myra's dad, J.W., is a bass player, and he's quick to discover that Memphis is an epicenter for a new kind of music, rock and roll.
Sam Phillips brought together many of the musicians from the South to create this new sound. He is the one who discovered Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. Sun Records, it's the birthplace of rock and roll.
When J.W. suffers a serious electrical accident at work, he gets a large settlement. It's the catalyst for a career change.
My daddy said, I'm going to go to Louisiana and find my cousin Jerry and see if he'll come to Memphis and we'll put together a band. He said, I've heard how great he is on the piano, how talented he is.
Only 21 years old, Jerry Lee Lewis has already been married twice. The first time when he was 16.
In the South, people got married young, that they started having kids really young, and that then they had a lot of them. That's the story of the Lewis family.
Jerry Lee now lives with his second wife, Jane, in Faraday, Louisiana.
Daddy found Jerry working at a little dive called the Wagon Wheel. Daddy went over and introduced himself and said, I would like for you to stay at my house as my guest. I'll take you to Sun Record, introduce you to Sam Phillips, and let's see about getting a contract. The phone rings, and I'm this 12-year-old kid. The man says, can I speak to J.W.? I need to get directions to your house. Jerry came in, and he was wearing a red plaid shirt. He had a haircut that was way too short because his ears stuck out. And he just looked like nothing special. But then he started playing the piano and immediately got my attention. It was like we were all mesmerized because he was just so good on the piano. My opinion changed drastically of him. His haircut didn't matter anymore.
I was 3 years old when he moved into our house. They practiced in the living room for a while, and his hands were so fast, it was just like they were in double motion. It was like he had four hands. It was just hard to believe that he could play it like that. And the man was a great musician.
Then Daddy took Jerry to Sun Records and had him audition. And that's how it all began. His first record was End of the Road and Crazy Arms. One day in the studio, my daddy said to him, "Jerry, play that Shakin' song." Because when they were traveling and doing shows, Jerry would do that song and the audience would just react like crazy. And that was a whole lot of shaking. And the first time Sam heard it, it was like, this is it, you know.
Myra has just turned 13 when her dad and Jerry fly to New York with their band to make their debut on live national television.
Mom and I were at home watching television, and you knew something great was coming out of this.
Come on over, baby. A whole lot of shaking going on.
And I guess seeing him on Steve Allen's show, he rose in my mind, you know, to a higher level.
It is safe to say that the overwhelming majority of the network TV viewing audience would never have seen anything like Jerry Lee Lewis before in their lives.
Oh, shake, baby. You can shake one time for me.
And for a young girl growing up in the South, just the notion that you would know somebody who would be on television was almost beyond imagination.
I was 13 years old. He became a little god in my mind and in a lot of people's mind at that time.
And when a whole lot of shaking hit, they went up to $10,000 a show. Now this is in the 50s, that's a lot of money.
Clearly, Steve Allen got a kick out of him very soon after he booked him to come back on.
Mr. Commotion himself, Jerry Lee Lewis. There he is.
So to get a second bite at that apple, national television, that was a big deal.
Goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
As Jerry's fame skyrockets, his marriage falls apart.
He knew what time school let out, and he would go up there. He'd say, "Hey, you want to go get some ice cream?" And he always knew I wanted to go get ice cream. Jerry and I, we would go to a movie after dinner or something like that. I thought he was being nice to a kid. I thought it was that kind of thing. You know, like pat the kid on top of the head or something. I was idolizing Jerry and looking up to him and thinking he's this great big star. What I didn't know was that he was falling in love with me.
Myra's parents had no idea that Jerry Lee was wooing their daughter. They knew the two had fun together, they knew they were friends, but it truly didn't occur to them that this older man would try to have a relationship with their child.
You know, after supper or something, we'd drive up to the A&W or whatever it is. And Jerry would kiss me. At first, I didn't know what to think about that. I mean, it was nice, but I was confused. I was like, I'm 13 years old. So it really messes with your mind. You don't understand what's going on, but you don't want it to stop either because it was you liked it. But that's how our relationship was.
Jerry never asked Myra to get married, per se. He got the marriage license by taking this older friend, I think she was in her 20s as well, to the courthouse and having her sign Myra's name to the license. Nobody questioned it. Apparently they didn't ask for ID back in those days.
And Jerry came back home. He said, "Come outside, I'm gonna show you something." So he pulled this paper out, and I looked at it, and it said, marriage license. And I looked at it, and I said, "You mean we're married?" And he said, No. We're not married. We're gonna get married." And I said, "What?" And he caught me by my arm and he turned me around and he said, Myra, I love you. And I want to marry you. And I think I just melted. I think it just, and I told him, and I said, no, I love you too. I said, but I'm still too young. This is crazy.
I think Jerry Lee was a predator. He wanted somebody he could mold into whoever he wanted. Myra was a good, dutiful girl, and so she was an easy mark for him.
December 12th, 1957 marks a crazy new chapter in 13-year-old Myra Brown's life.
We were having supper. Jerry said, Myra, you want to go to a movie? I said, yeah, sure. We got in the car, and Jerry headed toward Mississippi. And I'm going, is there a movie theater out this way? And he said, no, we're going to get married. He had found this pastor or whoever it was that was going to marry us. And I think I was in a coma. I think my eyes were like this. And I got out of the car. I had on the red dress that I wore to school that day. And we walked in this little chapel. I don't remember getting married, but I know it happened. And then these two little old ladies started throwing rice at us and all this kind of stuff. And I'm still like a deer caught in headlights. Now we've gone down there and gotten married and turned around and came right back. And we were probably gone less than an hour. The next morning I got up and I pulled my marriage license out and I left them laying out on the nightstand. And my mother's maid found them. And she handed my daddy the marriage license. And of course he took one look at it. And my daddy went and got his gun. And he said, I'm gonna go kill that son of a bitch.
He got in the car and took off. And Jerry was up at Sun Records at that time. Mama called Sam Phillips and said, Jay's on the way and he's got a gun. Is Jerry still there?
And Sam turned around and he looked at Jerry and he said, get in your car and get out of Memphis. So Jerry took off. Daddy drops up, barrels through the front door and says, where is that son of a bitch? And Sam sits Daddy down and tells him, we can't interfere in this life decision that's been made without you.
And he said, it looks to me like they love each other. And if we charge him, he's going to prison for a long time.
Daddy calms down and he goes back home and he tells Mom, we really don't have any choices because it's done. And we're going to have to hope for the best and learn to live with it.
It's against the law for married women to go to school in Tennessee, so 13-year-old Myra joins Jerry out on tour.
I didn't have a suitcase. The only thing I had was this round doll case that I had gotten at a Christmas or two before. And it was like a hat box, shaped like a hat box. And that's what I put my stuff in.
The next time JW sees Jerry is on stage at a gig in New York.
Jerry goes over to Daddy and he says, I love Myra, I'll take care of her. Music starts playing and it's accepted, it's forgotten. We went out and bought a little house. Actually, we bought the first house that had a for sale sign on it because we needed a house right away. I learned how to cook and learned how to vacuum. I had to become the adult. Jerry did two things. He played music, and he loved me. He came home, he brought all the money to me, dumped it in my lap.
It was a cash business, and Myra was in charge of taking the bags full of cash from his live performances to the bank. You really are talking about shopping bags with dollar bills in them. The notion that she was a central piece of keeping the Jerry Lee Lewis business going as a young teenager, as a girl, is pretty wild.
The first few months of 1958 tick by, and Jerry's star continues to rise.
It was a time that had never happened before, never will happen again. And the reaction of the public and the audience that made me kind of gasp. Like, look at how these people are just going berserk about him.
There for a while, he was the top dog. They had the top songs in the world.
Out of all of these figures, these kings of rock and roll, Elvis was a brilliant performer. He was cute. He had this sort of angel face. But Jerry Lee Lewis could play the piano better than anyone that was a part of this whole Sun Records crew. And Jerry Lee Lewis was fun. And fun was a huge part of the birth of rock and roll.
Private Elvis Presley makes this a VIP event. But the rock and roll star, wearing medals for carbine, pistol, and tank gunnery marksmanship, is modest as can be.
When Elvis is drafted into the Army, Jerry Lee is poised to become the new king of rock and roll.
And then they booked a big tour for Jerry in Europe in May of '58.
Elvis never went to England. Elvis never formed off of United States soil. So for one of those first-generation rock and rollers to make that trip and go over to England was a big deal.
The tour will be a surefire success if Jerry will heed the advice of Sam Phillips and not do one thing.
Don't bring Myra on tour with you. Don't bring her to London. And he ignored all of that good advice. His ego, I think, stood in the way. He just thought he was untouchable.
I didn't even know that Jerry had been warned. And he said to them, either she goes or I don't. And I think Jerry intimidated him and said, don't you talk to her. Leave my wife alone.
Myra, her brother Rusty, and their mom Lois accompany the band to England.
When we got there, they were standing there at the airport and, people just wanted to see everybody, because we were the biggest celebrities there was at that time.
The press was going to come on the plane and see Jerry and interview him. So I got off, and I'm walking around in the airport, and a man comes up to me, and he says, who are you, miss? You got off that plane, didn't you? And I said, I'm not anybody. He said, well, who are you? And I said, I'm Jerry's wife. And the guy asked me how old I was, and I said, I'm 15. I figured I could lie a little bit. His face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he took off. I had no idea. I was talking to a reporter. And I'm clueless that there could be a problem. I wish that somebody would have said, if people find out Jerry's married to a kid, it ain't gonna be pretty. Myra, you're a bomb.
It's May 1958, and the news of 13-year-old Myra Lewis's marriage to Jerry Lee is about to erupt in the British press. Initially, Jerry's British fans give him a warm reception.
They were at the airport. They were out in the streets. They were in the lobby. People loved Jerry so much, they were hanging out of the hotel windows all around our hotel.
But the tone abruptly changes the following day.
The reporter followed up, figured out Myra was 13, figured out she was his cousin and that Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't actually even divorced from his second wife yet. This was a bombshell.
The next morning, the news media said, Jerry Lee Lewis is here with his child bride, Myra.
He's a pedophile, he's a bigamist, he's a liar and a fraud. There's a call to boycott the shows, and very quickly, Jerry Lee finds himself playing to half-empty theaters where people are heckling and booing him.
And they went after Jerry Lee, they went after Myra. She was in the car with her mother and her little brother. The paparazzi surrounded the car and they were shaking it so violently, they thought the car was going to be turned over.
And Scotland Yard came to the hotel and told us, we can't guarantee your safety.
They end up coming back to America, where they hoped it would blow over, but nothing blew over.
Why did you leave? Well, I don't answer those questions, sir. My manager might knock my head off or something.
That one event turned our life upside down and changed the direction of everything. Nobody wanted to be a part of this.
Were you there, Mrs. Lewis?
I was there, but I wasn't at the show.
Oh, you weren't at the shows. Oh, did you notice anything like that sort of reception?
No, it was a very good reception, I thought.
He went from making thousands of dollars a night down to making a few $100s a night. I felt guilty because of it. I didn't make it happen, but I didn't stop it from happening. And I could have, because I was the one that let the cat out of the bag.
After they came back and after his divorce was finalized, he remarried Myra so that there was no question that this was a marriage in good standing, but the damage was done.
It destroyed a man's career, but it didn't destroy our marriage. If anything, it made it stronger because we were attacked. We don't care what the world says or does. We should love each other.
Soon, Myra is overjoyed to learn that she's pregnant.
I always loved children. What I had wanted all my life was a house, a home, and a baby.
But a few months into her pregnancy, Myra is forced to leave her home.
Jerry wasn't having the income that he had, and he was the sole supporter of his mother, father, and 2 sisters. So my house got shut down, not theirs. And I had to go live with them in Fairday, Louisiana. It was not comfortable because they resented the fact that Jerry married me. It was not a fun situation to live in the house with those people. One day, Jerry walked into the room and he reached down and he picked up my typewriter and he held it above his head like he was gonna slam it down on me. And I looked up at him and it's like, what happened? And he threw it on the floor. And he said, one of his sisters, Linda Gale, told me that she was with you the other day and y'all were driving down the road and you were smoking a cigarette and flirting with a sailor. Neither one was true. The only reason she would tell him that was to make him mad at me.
But all is forgiven when Myra gives birth to a baby boy on February 27th, 1959.
Myra had Stevie when she was 14 years old, and she was thrilled. She knew she was pretty young to be having one, but still, it was what she always wanted.
Oh, he was precious. He was a sweet baby. He was a smart baby. Jerry wanted to name him after Steve Allen for giving him his first break on nationwide television.
Myra is over the moon when they move back to Memphis and her mom, dad, and brother get to meet her baby boy.
It was great because it was like I had a little brother, you know, because I was with him all the time. And, you know, she was a great mama.
In 1960, the Lewises learn that Elvis has returned to Memphis from his stint in the Army. And just like Jerry, Elvis has fallen in love with a teenage girl.
Elvis Presley was in love with Priscilla when he was 24 and she was 14. Luckily for him, he had Jerry Lee Lewis's example.
Clearly, Elvis's team learned from the disaster of Jerry Lee and Myra and entered into the relationship with Priscilla in a very different way. Waited much longer on the marriage.
Priscilla Presley was beautiful and glamorous and did her hair and her makeup and was in the public eye. Jerry Lee didn't want Myra to be anything like Priscilla Presley. Myra was only to belong to him. He didn't want other men to be attracted to Myra in any way. Jerry Lee wanted Myra to be invisible.
I couldn't wear shorts. We had a swimming pool, and he didn't want me going swimming when there was other men out there. It was so uncalled for.
Only 17 years old, Myra submits to Jerry's demands and embraces her role as wife and mother. But nothing prepares her for what happens on Easter Sunday, 1962.
Myra was at home with her 3-year-old son, Stevie, her father-in-law, Elmo, and Jerry's uncle, George, and she was going to cook dinner. And she was asking Elmo what he wanted, and he was listing some things, and said, well, we better go inside and make a list. So she asked Uncle George, would you watch Stevie? And he said, sure. And so she and Elmo went inside, and she wrote a grocery list. They went back outside.
And Uncle George was there, and Stevie wasn't. And I said, Uncle George, where'd Stevie go? He said, he went in the house with you. Well, didn't he go in the house with you? I ran in the house and I looked for him. And I came back out. There was this, he'd been playing with a hose. And he'd been pulling it. And I followed the hose around the house. And I looked, and the hose was in the swimming pool. And the water was rippling. And I started screaming.
Myra Lewis is 17 years old when her 3-year-old son drowns in a tragic accident.
Myra remembers almost nothing between the incident at the pool and the funeral. What she remembers is Jerry Lee picking her up off of Stevie's grave. She was lying on his grave and wouldn't leave because she wouldn't leave her child alone.
I was so heartbroken over losing Stevie. I mean, it was the most God's awful thing could happen to any human on this earth.
There were times when she didn't want to go on. She didn't know if she could live without her baby, without her child. And then she got pregnant again. And it was with the birth of Phoebe that she realized she had to stay alive.
She just unbroke my heart. You know, she made me proud and happy to have a child again in my arms that I could hold and kiss, and gave me back something that I had lost. It was a welcoming, wonderful thing that happened.
In 1964, the Beatles conquer America and transform the sound of rock and roll. By this time, unable to repeat his success on the charts, Jerry Lee has left Sun Records. At home, he becomes increasingly controlling.
No matter what she did to try to please him, it was never enough. Nothing was ever good enough.
It ripped my self-esteem away from me. One night, Jerry was coming home, but I didn't know he was coming home that night. He said, I'm hungry, you got to fix me something to eat. Okay. When a neighbor had made some spaghetti sauce for me, and I walked by him and he said, this don't taste like your spaghetti. And I said, Bonnie made it and gave it to me. And he said, what? And he picked his tray up and threw it at me.
Jerry's bad behavior continues, even when he starts making a comeback in a new genre in the 1960s.
Who's gonna play this old piano after I'm not here?
He never returns as a rock and roll star, but eventually moves into a much more straight-ahead country style.
When country music kind of became outlaw country and was more sort of open to rebellious figures, they welcomed Jerry Lee Lewis.
I started playing with him a lot and then went full time with him later on, after I got out of high school.
When Another Place, Another Time shoots up the country charts in 1968, Jerry's career is on the ascent.
Jerry went from a little bit of success to more success to really being one of the most successful recording artists in the country music community by sort of the end of the 60s.
Jerry's second chance at fame is not enough to right his failing marriage.
When the good times came back for Jerry's career, things went to hell quickly. Jerry would turn into Jekyll and Hyde. Mid-afternoon, when Jerry was gone and going to play a show that night, I'd talk to him. And he'd say things like, hey, babe, what you doing? Da-da-da-da-da. We'd just chit-chat, normal. After the show, I could get a phone call from him. Who the hell do you think you are telling me that I shouldn't drink liquor or something like this? The next morning, Jerry would wake up and call me and say, hey, babe, what you doing? Jekyll and Hyde.
Jerry Lee, while he was on the road, began taking drugs, and Myra noticed a drastic difference in him. He would just be totally out of control, accusing her of cheating on him while he was out of town, which was totally not Myra. He had no evidence whatsoever. He was just high on drugs.
I would imagine Myra feeling completely overwhelmed and confused. These were prescription pills, they were sort of like performance enhancers. They were marketed from doctors. There wasn't the knowledge that we have today. He became a raw nerve, yelling, screaming. Jerry Lee Lewis had a terrible temper and a lot of conflict, but you take all of that and then you combine it with amphetamines and booze and sleeplessness, it's like pouring lighter fuel on a fire.
Yeah, he slapped me. Yeah, he did. That's what he would do to people. He'd slap them in the face. But when he slapped me, I would end up on the floor because the force was too hard.
Then, 12 years into her marriage, Myra gets a phone call that will ultimately destroy the relationship. Jerry Lee has been living a double life.
I just fell apart. I couldn't take another day of it.
In 1970, Myra Lewis gets a phone call that shatters her belief in Jerry Lee.
The anonymous phone call was that Jerry had been seeing other women and just picking up women on the road, and it was something that had been ongoing for many years.
In fact, he had started cheating on her only 11 months after they first got married.
Myra is devastated. She runs down to her local church to seek solace.
I knelt down at the altar and I was crying so hard that I was not even able to say a word. But that was the moment of knowing without a doubt that this was not the man I was going to spend my life with. This was not what I bargained for. I think maybe in my heart I knew that it wasn't reasonable that a man goes out and plays music and drinks and takes drugs and there's women throwing themselves at him. It's not reasonable to think he's not gonna take advantage of that. But I could, because he told me he didn't. And when I realized that it was a lie. And it had been a lie for a very long time. I knew there was no going back.
Jerry is out of town. By the time he gets home, Myra and Phoebe have moved in with JW and Lois.
Jerry was continuously calling me, want me to come back to him and all this kind of stuff. And I went over to the house to get something, and I went in and I was in the den and I heard somebody going, "Get her out the window." Jerry was in our bedroom with a girl in his bed. And I walked in there and said, "Oh, no, yeah, you miss me and you love me and you want me back, right? And this is what you're doing, laying in my bed with another woman." So, I mean, I'd been gone 2 or 3 days.
He begged her to come back, but she wasn't falling for it.
And that's when she got that apartment. And I went over and stayed with her while she was staying there, and they was getting her divorced. I was asleep and I heard glass break. And I ran down the stairs, and it was Jerry. He was trying to come through the window. Jerry saw me and I said, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "I just need to talk to Myra so you don't talk to her coming through the window."
I was married at 13, divorced at 26. Half of my life was spent with Jerry.
The leaving, of course, was hard. She had no education. She wasn't going to have any money because Jerry Lee didn't manage money well, and whatever they had, it was spent whenever he made it. She did get some child support as long as she would go beg for it. Jerry did see Phoebe on a regular basis. Myra always felt absolutely certain that keeping that relationship between the father and daughter was an important thing to do.
Myra relocates to Atlanta, Georgia. But as she starts to rebuild her life, Jerry starts to unravel. He's arrested for driving under the influence several times.
I was taking a lot of pills at the time, you know. Nobody had mentioned it to me. I said anything about it, and I didn't know that I was in that bad a shape.
Jerry has numerous weapons violations and accidentally shoots his bass player while drunk.
Just a couple of months after shooting his bass player, Jerry Lee shows up, drunk and belligerent at Graceland, smashes his car into the front gates, is yelling for Elvis to come down, and pulls out his gun and starts firing that, and then is hauled in and arrested for that. That was the next example of chaos.
That was kind of around the same time when I decided to go into real estate. I'm here by myself. I've got a child to raise. What do I want to do?
She went back to school, got her GED. She then got her real estate license and eventually her broker's license. Myra was very successful in real estate in Atlanta, Georgia.
I was in the President's Club every year. I was a $1 million producer, and I loved every second of it.
She worked for Richard Williams. She was an agent in his firm. He was a divorced man, and she admired him immensely. And after 4 years, one day, he asked her to lunch. And the sparks flew, apparently, because they ended up getting married.
Richard Williams and I were married on June 1984. He's a gentleman. He's kind. He'll do anything in the world for me. He vacuums. I have somebody I can take care of and somebody that I know is going to take care of me. And it took a long time to get to it all, but it's been what I want.
After Myra's marriage to Richard, most news of Jerry continues to be troubling.
There are a series of marriages, many of which just end in terrible and tragic or suspect circumstances. One wife dies under very sketchy circumstances that, as reporters investigate, point toward his guilt and culpability in her death. And none of this is ever in any serious way investigated or explored by the authorities.
Really, sincerely, I would like to say one more time what a great honor it is to be back in London, England. I feel like this is home to me, you know. Oh, this is where I first come over and I brought my little 13-year-old cousin with me. Remember that?
He was widely celebrated. He was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the first class. Jerry Lee also was very distinct within that first generation of rock and roll. First of all, he stayed alive longer than the rest of them, but Jerry Lee Lewis was also in a class of his own when it came to bad behavior.
But then what's behind that is this remarkable woman who took something from that, who took something beyond just being scarred by it and, was able to turn her life into something else.
I mean, there's been so many blessings and so many good things and so much.
The call came in just after dawn, at that hour when the world feels suspended between sleep and waking, when the air is still cold and the light has not yet decided what kind of day it will become. On the other end of the line was a young man, his voice trembling, cracking under a weight too heavy for words to carry. He was trying to speak, but what came out was fragmented, almost incoherent, as if language itself had failed him. He kept repeating the same thing, over and over, like a mind trapped in a loop it could not escape. 5 people were dead. All of them. His family. There was something in his voice that unsettled even the most seasoned dispatcher. Not just panic, not just shock. Something else. Something harder to name. It wasn't the chaos of someone discovering a nightmare. It felt rehearsed and yet completely broken at the same time, like a script being read by someone who didn't fully understand the role they were playing. Outside, the quiet streets of Dunedin were just beginning to stir. Curtains twitched open. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Milk bottles sat untouched on doorsteps. It was an ordinary morning in a quiet New Zealand suburb, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens, where people leave their doors unlocked and know the names of their neighbors' children. And yet, inside a modest, aging house on every street, something unspeakable had already happened. When the police arrived, the front door was not locked. It didn't need to be forced open. It swung inward with a soft, almost reluctant creak, as if the house itself resisted what it was about to reveal. The officers stepped inside cautiously, their instincts already on edge, though they didn't yet know why. At first, it was the silence that struck them. Not the peaceful silence of a sleeping home, but a dense, suffocating stillness. The kind that presses against your ears. The kind that makes every footstep feel too loud, every breath intrusive. It was the silence of a place where life had been violently interrupted. Then came the smell. Faint, metallic, unmistakable. They moved deeper into the house, calling out, announcing their presence, but no one answered. No movement. No voices. Just that heavy stillness, clinging to the walls. The first body was found quickly. Then another. And another. By the time they had cleared the house, 5 members of the same family lay dead in different rooms. Their lives ended in a way that suggested not chaos, but something more deliberate. More controlled. There were signs of struggle in certain areas, but not everywhere. Some rooms looked almost untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet, everything had. The officers began to piece together what they were seeing, but the scene refused to settle into something coherent. It didn't behave the way it should have. There were details that didn't quite align, fragments that resisted forming a clear narrative. In the middle of it all was the one person who had called it in. David Bain. He was there when police arrived, though not inside the house. He stood outside, pale and shaking, his clothes slightly disheveled, his eyes wide in a way that suggested he was seeing something no one else could. Or perhaps trying very hard not to see it. He told them he had just come home. That he had been out delivering newspapers, like he did every morning. That this was part of his routine. That he had walked back into his house expecting nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and instead found his entire family dead. He said he didn't understand. He said it over and over again. He didn't understand. But even in those first moments, before the full weight of the investigation had begun, before the forensic teams arrived, before the headlines would explode across the country, there was a question forming quietly in the background. A question that would grow louder with every passing hour. Why was he the only one left alive? It's a simple question, almost instinctive. In cases of violence within a household, survival is rarely random. It follows patterns, motives, intentions. When 5 people die and 1 remains, that one becomes the center of gravity for everything that follows. At first, though, he was treated as what he appeared to be, a survivor. A young man who had just lost his entire family in a single morning. Someone who needed protection, not suspicion. But grief is a complicated thing. It doesn't follow a script. And neither, it seemed, did David. Witnesses would later recall small details. The way he spoke. The pauses between his words. The strange mixture of panic and detachment. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything. Not yet. But it was enough to make people uneasy. Inside the house, the officers continued their work. Each room told part of a story, but none of them told the whole thing. There were signs that suggested a sequence of events, a movement from one space to another, as if the violence had unfolded in stages. But the order was unclear. The logic incomplete. And then there was the weapon. A rifle. It belonged to the family. That detail alone shifted something in the atmosphere. This wasn't an intrusion by a stranger breaking in from the outside. This was something that had happened within the walls of the home, using something that was already there. Something familiar. The kind of violence that doesn't come from nowhere, but from somewhere much closer. As the morning wore on, the house filled with investigators, forensic specialists, photographers. Every surface was examined. Every trace collected. Every possibility considered. But the deeper they looked, the more complicated the picture became. There were footprints that seemed to overlap, patterns that were difficult to interpret. There were indications of struggle in some places, but not in others. There were questions about timing, about movement, about who had been where and when. And then there was a detail that, at first, seemed almost insignificant. A computer. It had been turned on. In a house where 5 people had just been killed, in the immediate aftermath of unimaginable violence, someone had taken the time to interact with a computer. To open a file. To leave behind something that might have been a message. It didn't fit. Or perhaps it fit too well. Because suddenly, the narrative began to shift. What if this wasn't just a tragedy? What if it was something else entirely? As the investigators stepped back and looked at the scene as a whole, the question that had been quietly forming began to take shape more clearly, more sharply. What if the person who made that call wasn't just the one who found the bodies? What if he was the one who knew exactly how they got there? Outside, the day had fully arrived. The sun climbed higher, casting light over a neighborhood that now felt irrevocably changed. News began to spread, first in whispers, then in urgent conversations, then across radio and television. 5 people dead. 1 survivor. A family destroyed in a way that defied easy explanation. And at the center of it all, a young man whose story would soon be examined from every possible angle, whose every word would be dissected, whose every movement would be questioned. Because in cases like this, the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once. It hides in the gaps. In the inconsistencies. In the small, almost invisible details that don't quite belong. And as the investigation began to unfold, those details would start to surface, one by one, each of them pulling the story in a different direction. Was this the act of an outsider? A random, senseless act of violence? Or was it something far more intimate, far more disturbing? Something that had been building quietly, behind closed doors, long before that morning call was ever made. The answers would not come easily. And when they did, they would only deepen the mystery. Because this was not just a story about what happened inside that house. It was a story about doubt. About perception. About how truth can fracture into competing versions, each one convincing, each one incomplete. And long after the sirens faded, long after the trial would end, long after the world thought it had moved on, one question would continue to echo through the years, refusing to settle, refusing to disappear. What really happened inside that house on that cold June morning? And perhaps more importantly, who, if anyone, was telling the truth? Dunedin is the kind of place that doesn't prepare you for violence. It sits low and quiet along the southeastern edge of New Zealand's South Island, wrapped in cold ocean air and long stretches of grey sky. The city has a certain stillness to it, the kind that settles into your bones if you stay long enough. Mornings arrive slowly there. Light seeps in rather than bursts. Streets wake up in increments, not all at once. It's a place where routine matters, where familiarity becomes a kind of comfort people rarely question. Every street, despite its almost ironic name, was not remarkable in any obvious way. A row of modest homes, some aging more gracefully than others, sat behind small yards that carried the marks of everyday life. Fences slightly uneven, gardens half-tended, driveways with oil stains that told quiet stories of years gone by. The Bain house did not stand out at first glance. It blended into its surroundings with a kind of tired anonymity, the paint slightly worn, the structure carrying the subtle sag of a home that had seen better years. But if you stood still long enough, if you let your eyes linger instead of pass over it, you might notice something else. Not something dramatic or immediately alarming, but something quieter. A sense that the house held more inside it than it showed to the street. Curtains that stayed drawn longer than most. A yard that felt less like a place of leisure and more like an afterthought. Small details that, on their own, meant nothing, but together suggested a life lived under a kind of weight. Inside that house lived the Bain family. Robin Bain, the father, was a man shaped by discipline and routine. He worked as a teacher, a role that carried both respect and expectation in a community like Dunedin. On the surface, he was reserved, even distant. The kind of man who kept his thoughts close, who spoke when necessary but rarely more than that. There was an intensity to him, though it wasn't always visible. It came through in moments, in the way he carried himself, in the quiet rigidity of his posture, in the sense that there was always something unresolved just beneath the surface. Margaret Bain, the mother, was different. Where Robin seemed contained, Margaret carried a gentler presence. She had trained as a nurse, a profession that suggested patience, care, and resilience. But by the time of that winter in 1994, her life had narrowed. She spent most of her time at home, and those who knew her would later speak of a woman who seemed worn down by something difficult to define. Not broken, not defeated, but strained. As if she had been holding something together for a long time, and it was beginning to show. The children each moved through the house in their own orbit. Arawa, one of the daughters, had a sensitivity that set her apart. She was introspective, thoughtful, sometimes described as fragile. There were indications that she struggled internally, though like many things in that household, the full extent of it was not always visible to outsiders. Her presence in the home added a layer of quiet complexity, a reminder that not all battles are fought in the open. Laniet, the older sister, carried herself differently. There was a sense of independence about her, a tension between who she was and where she came from. She had spent time away from home, and her relationship with the family was not without strain. There were undercurrents there, things unspoken or only partially acknowledged. Her return to the house, shortly before the events of that morning, would later become one of many details investigators would examine closely. Stephen, the youngest, was still finding his place in the world. A teenager navigating the uncertain space between childhood and adulthood. There is often an assumption that youth brings a kind of insulation from the darker aspects of life, but in reality, it simply means those aspects are experienced differently. Through confusion, through silence, through questions that don't yet have answers. And then there was David. At 22 years old, he was no longer a child, but he hadn't fully stepped into adulthood either. He lived at home, studied at university, and worked a paper route in the early hours of the morning. His life, at least from the outside, followed a predictable rhythm. Wake before dawn, deliver newspapers through the quiet streets of Dunedin, return home as the city began to stir. It was a solitary routine, one that placed him in the stillness of the early morning, moving through neighborhoods while most people were still asleep. There was something isolating about that kind of schedule. Hours spent alone, in the dark, with only the sound of bicycle tires against pavement or the soft thud of newspapers landing on doorsteps. It's the kind of routine that gives a person time to think. Sometimes too much time. The Bain household, despite being full of people, did not always feel full. There were tensions that existed beneath the surface, the kind that don't always manifest as open conflict but instead settle into the atmosphere. Financial strain had been a factor. The house itself reflected that. It was not in pristine condition. There were reports of clutter, of maintenance left undone, of a general sense that the family was managing rather than thriving. But tension in a household is not unusual. Many families carry stress, disagreement, moments of distance. What made the Bain family different, what would later draw so much attention, was not just that those tensions existed, but how little was truly understood about them before everything changed. Neighbors saw fragments. A passing conversation. A glimpse through a window. The sound of movement inside the house. But fragments are not the same as a full picture. And in this case, the full picture would only begin to emerge after it was already too late. The winter of 1994 had settled heavily over Dunedin. Cold mornings, damp air, the kind of chill that lingers even after the sun rises. On the morning of June 20th, nothing about the weather suggested that the day would be anything other than ordinary. The city moved through its routines. People woke, dressed, stepped outside into the cold, began their day. Somewhere in that routine, David Bain was already out on his paper route. He moved through the streets as he always did, delivering newspapers to doorsteps that would soon be opened by people expecting nothing more than the news of the day. It's a quiet kind of work, almost invisible. The person delivering the paper is rarely seen, rarely acknowledged. They pass through the edges of other people's lives without leaving much of a trace. But on that particular morning, the routine carried a different weight. Because while David moved through the city, something was happening inside his home. Or perhaps it had already happened. Time, in cases like this, becomes fluid. Moments stretch, overlap, blur into one another. The exact sequence of events can be difficult to pin down, especially when the only person who can speak to it is also the person at the center of suspicion. When David returned home, the narrative he would present was simple. He had been out working. He had come back expecting the house to be as he left it. Instead, he found something unimaginable. But simplicity in storytelling does not always reflect simplicity in truth. Inside the Bain house, each room held a piece of a story that no one yet fully understood. The layout of the home, the positioning of furniture, the placement of personal belongings, all of it would soon be examined in minute detail. Investigators would walk those rooms again and again, tracing steps, reconstructing movements, trying to understand how a normal morning had turned into a scene of devastation. And yet, even before the investigation began in earnest, the setting itself offered clues. This was not a random location. Not a place chosen by chance. It was a home, with all the familiarity and intimacy that word implies. The people inside knew each other. They shared space, routines, histories. They existed within a network of relationships that outsiders could only partially see. Violence in such a setting carries a different kind of weight. It is not just about what happened, but about who it happened between. The walls of that house had absorbed years of conversation, silence, routine, conflict, reconciliation. They had witnessed the slow accumulation of everyday life. And now, they held the aftermath of something that had shattered all of it in a matter of moments. As the city continued its day, as people went to work, attended classes, met friends, the Bain house became something else entirely. Not just a home, but a focal point. A place where questions would converge, where assumptions would be challenged, where the line between victim and suspect would begin to blur. Because understanding what happened inside that house required more than just examining the events of a single morning. It required understanding the people who lived there. Their relationships. Their struggles. Their silences. And perhaps most importantly, the things they never said out loud. The setting of this story is not just Dunedin, or every street, or a modest house with worn paint and drawn curtains. It is the space between appearances and reality, between what is seen and what is hidden, between the life a family presents to the world and the one they live behind closed doors. And it is within that space that the truth, whatever it may be, begins to take shape. To understand what was lost inside that house on that winter morning, you have to move away from the violence for a moment and step into the quieter spaces where life still existed, where routines formed and personalities unfolded in ways that rarely made headlines. Because before they became victims, the Bain family were individuals, each carrying their own rhythms, their own private worlds, their own ways of coping with the pressures that pressed in on them from all sides. Margaret Bain moved through the house with a kind of quiet persistence that often goes unnoticed until it's gone. There was a gentleness in the way she handled things, a deliberate softness that seemed almost like a response to something harder beneath the surface of her life. She had once trained as a nurse, a role that requires steadiness in the face of discomfort, an ability to remain composed when others are not. That part of her never fully disappeared, even as her world narrowed to the walls of the home. But there were signs, subtle at first and then harder to ignore, that she was carrying something heavy. Those who encountered her in passing might have noticed the pauses in conversation, the slight delay before a response, the way her attention sometimes seemed to drift elsewhere, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand attention. But it was there, quietly shaping the way she existed in that space. Robin Bain, by contrast, seemed to operate under a different kind of tension. He was a man of structure, of expectation, someone who believed in order even when the world around him refused to cooperate. As a teacher, he occupied a position that required authority, clarity, a sense of control. But at home, control is harder to maintain. The dynamics shift. Roles blur. The same traits that create structure in one environment can create distance in another. There were indications that Robin struggled with that distance, though not always in ways that were immediately visible. He could be reserved to the point of withdrawal, his internal world largely inaccessible to those around him. And yet, there were moments when that internal world seemed to press outward, when the tension became visible in small, sharp ways. A look held too long. A response that carried more weight than the words themselves. The kind of moments that pass quickly but leave something behind. Their children grew within that environment, each responding to it differently, each finding their own way to exist within the same set of circumstances. Arawa Bain carried a sensitivity that made the world feel closer, more immediate, sometimes overwhelming. She was introspective, often turning inward rather than outward, processing things in ways that didn't always translate easily into conversation. There were reports of her struggling emotionally, of periods where her internal state became difficult to manage. But those struggles were not always visible in a consistent way. There were also moments of calm, of normalcy, of quiet presence that suggested a complexity not easily reduced to a single narrative. She existed in that in-between space, where vulnerability and resilience coexist, where a person can appear steady one moment and deeply unsettled the next. Laniet Bain's relationship with the family was more visibly strained. She had spent time away from home, creating distance not just physically but emotionally. Her return to the house was not a simple reintegration into a familiar environment. It carried with it a history, a set of experiences and tensions that did not simply disappear upon her arrival. There was a sense that she had seen something beyond the confines of that home, something that made returning to it more complicated. Conversations involving her could carry an edge, a subtle friction that suggested unresolved issues. Not always overt, not always escalating into conflict, but present nonetheless. The kind of tension that lingers beneath the surface, shaping interactions in ways that are felt more than openly acknowledged. Stephen Bain, still in his teenage years, occupied a different position within the family dynamic. He was young enough to still be forming his understanding of the world, but old enough to be aware of the undercurrents around him. Adolescence often comes with its own internal struggles, its own sense of uncertainty and shifting identity. In a household where tension existed, those struggles can take on different forms. There were glimpses of Stephen as a typical teenager, engaged in his own interests, navigating friendships, school, the gradual movement toward independence. But there were also indications that he was not entirely untouched by the atmosphere of the home. It's difficult to remain unaffected when the environment itself carries a certain weight, even if that weight is not always openly discussed. And then there was David Bain, the one who would survive. He occupied a unique position within the family, both part of it and, in some ways, slightly apart. At 22, he was old enough to step fully into his own life, but he remained within the structure of the home. His routine was different from the rest. While others slept, he was awake, moving through the dark streets of Dunedin, delivering newspapers in the early hours of the morning. There is something isolating about that kind of schedule. It places a person at the edges of normal life, awake when others are not, moving through spaces that feel temporarily disconnected from the rest of the world. Those early morning hours can create a kind of mental space that is both expansive and enclosed. With no one else around, thoughts have room to stretch, to repeat, to deepen. For some, it's a time of clarity. For others, it can become something more complicated. A space where internal narratives grow louder, where unresolved questions linger without interruption. David was described in different ways by different people. Some saw him as quiet, reserved, someone who kept to himself. Others noted a certain awkwardness, a difficulty in social situations that made him seem slightly out of sync with those around him. These descriptions are not unusual on their own. Many people exist in that space without it leading anywhere significant. But in the context of what would later happen, every detail began to take on a different weight. Inside the Bain household, daily life continued in a pattern that, from the outside, might have seemed unremarkable. Meals were prepared. Conversations happened, some brief, some more extended. People moved through rooms, crossed paths in hallways, existed together in a shared space that held both connection and distance. There were likely moments of normalcy, even warmth, that never made it into any report or testimony. Those moments are often the first to disappear when a tragedy reframes everything that came before it. But there were also signs that not everything was stable. Financial strain had placed pressure on the family. The house itself reflected that strain, not in any single dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small details. Maintenance left undone. Spaces that felt more functional than cared for. An overall sense that resources were limited, that priorities had to be managed carefully. Financial stress doesn't always lead to visible conflict, but it can create a background tension that influences everything else. There were also indications of emotional strain within the family. Not constant, not always visible, but present enough that those who looked closely could sense it. Relationships that carried complexity, interactions that suggested more beneath the surface than was being expressed. The kind of environment where things are not necessarily broken, but not entirely whole either. It is important to understand that none of this, on its own, predicts what would happen. Many families live with stress, with emotional complexity, with financial difficulty. Most do not end in violence. But when trying to understand a tragedy, these details become part of the landscape. They form the context in which everything else unfolds. On the morning of June 20th, each member of the Bain family began their day within that context. Margaret, likely moving through her routine, perhaps already awake, perhaps preparing for the day in the quiet way she often did. Robin, existing within his own structure, his own internal framework that guided how he approached each day. Arawa and Stephen, still in their rooms, suspended in that space between sleep and waking. Laniet, recently returned, occupying a place in the house that was both familiar and complicated. And David, already gone, moving through the cold streets, engaged in a routine that placed him physically outside the home at a crucial moment. What each of them thought in those early hours, what they felt, what they carried with them from the days before, is something that can only be partially reconstructed. There are no recordings of those moments, no complete account of the internal states that existed within that house before everything changed. But what is clear is that they were there, alive, moving through their own versions of that morning, unaware of how it would end. The story of the victims is not just about the way they died, but about the lives they lived up to that point. The routines that shaped them, the relationships that defined them, the small, ordinary moments that made up the majority of their existence. Those are the things that are often overshadowed by the violence that follows. In this case, 5 individuals, each with their own complexities, their own histories, their own ways of navigating the world, were reduced in a matter of hours to a single, shared label. Victims. But before that label was applied, they were something else entirely. They were a family. Complicated, imperfect, carrying both connection and distance, shaped by circumstances both visible and hidden. And whatever happened inside that house on that morning, it happened to all of them, in ways that cannot be fully understood by looking only at the aftermath. Because the true weight of what was lost is not measured solely by the violence itself, but by everything that existed before it. Everything that no longer had the chance to continue. The morning did not begin with violence. It rarely does. It begins in fragments, in small, ordinary movements that give no indication of what is about to unfold. A shift in bed. The quiet creak of floorboards. The faint light pressing against the edges of drawn curtains. In a house like the Bain home, those early hours would have carried a familiar rhythm, one shaped by routine and repetition, by the unspoken agreement of how each day begins. But on this particular morning, something broke that rhythm. What we know about the events inside the house does not come from a single, clear account. It comes from reconstruction, from interpretation, from the careful and sometimes conflicting reading of physical evidence left behind. There is no single voice that can describe exactly what happened, no definitive sequence that everyone agrees upon. Instead, there are pieces. Moments inferred from position, from damage, from the silent testimony of a space that witnessed everything and can explain nothing. Somewhere inside that house, the first shot was fired. It is impossible to say with absolute certainty where it began. Some believe it started in one room, others argue for a different point of origin. But what is clear is that the violence did not happen all at once. It moved. It progressed. It carried from one space to another, leaving behind a trail that investigators would later attempt to follow like a map drawn in reverse. In one room, there were signs of struggle. Not chaotic, not prolonged, but enough to suggest that the person inside did not simply accept what was happening. There was movement, resistance, an attempt to respond in the face of something sudden and overwhelming. The kind of reaction that is instinctive, immediate, driven not by thought but by the body's refusal to surrender without effort. In another room, the scene was different. There was less disruption, less indication of movement. It suggested a different moment, a different interaction. Perhaps the element of surprise was greater there. Perhaps the timing was different. These variations are what make the reconstruction so complex, because they suggest not a single event, but a series of encounters, each with its own dynamics, its own brief and irreversible conclusion. The rifle used in the killings was not foreign to the house. It belonged there. It was part of the environment, a presence that had existed long before that morning. That detail changes the nature of the event. It removes the randomness of an external intrusion and replaces it with something more contained, more intimate. The violence did not arrive from outside. It emerged from within. As the sequence unfolded, each member of the family encountered that violence in their own moment, in their own space. There was no gathering, no single point where they were all present together. Instead, the house became a series of isolated scenes, connected by movement, by timing, by the path taken from one room to the next. At some point, the father, Robin Bain, became part of that sequence. His position in the final reconstruction would later become one of the most contested aspects of the entire case. The question of where he was, when he encountered the violence, and what role he played, if any, would remain central to every theory that followed. Margaret Bain's presence in the sequence carried its own set of interpretations. The details surrounding her final moments suggested a different kind of interaction, one that would later be examined closely for what it might reveal about the order of events, about the mindset of whoever was responsible. Arawa and Stephen, in their respective spaces, became part of the same unfolding pattern. Each room holding its own version of the same story, each scene contributing to a larger picture that refused to fully settle into clarity. Laniet Bain's position added another layer of complexity. Her recent return to the home, her relationship with the family, the space she occupied within the house, all of it became relevant in understanding how the sequence might have unfolded. The details of her final moments would later be scrutinized, not just for what they revealed about the act itself, but for what they might suggest about motive, about intent, about the nature of the violence. Throughout all of this, there is an absence that is just as significant as the presence of any evidence. There is no clear indication of hesitation. No obvious break in the sequence that suggests a loss of control or a sudden change of mind. The movement from one room to another, from one person to the next, appears deliberate. Not rushed, not chaotic, but methodical in a way that raises difficult questions about the mindset required to carry out such actions. And yet, there are also elements that resist that interpretation. Details that suggest imperfection, inconsistency, moments where the scene does not align neatly with the idea of a fully controlled sequence. These contradictions are what make the case so difficult to resolve, because they allow for multiple readings, multiple narratives that can each find some support in the same set of facts. At some point in this sequence, the computer in the house was used. This detail stands apart from the others, not because it is more dramatic, but because it introduces a different kind of action into the timeline. While the rest of the events are defined by physical movement, by direct interaction, the use of the computer suggests a pause, a moment of engagement with something abstract, something removed from the immediate physical environment. A file was opened. A message appeared. Its content would later become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. Not just for what it said, but for what it implied about timing, about intention, about who was present and capable of creating it at that specific moment. The presence of that message disrupts any attempt to view the sequence as purely physical. It introduces the possibility of reflection, of communication, of an attempt to leave something behind. But whether that attempt was genuine or staged is a question that would divide opinions for years to come. As the sequence of events drew to a close, the house fell into silence again. But it was not the same silence that had existed before. This was a silence filled with aftermath, with the absence of movement, with the finality of what had occurred. Each room held its own version of that silence, shaped by what had taken place within it. Together, they formed a whole that was both connected and fragmented, a series of moments that could be linked, but not easily resolved. Outside, the world continued as it always does. The early morning gave way to day. Light spread across the streets of Dunedin. People stepped out of their homes, unaware that just a short distance away, something had happened that would ripple far beyond that single house. And at some point after the sequence had ended, after the last movement, the last action, the last moment of life within those walls, the story shifted from what had happened to how it would be discovered. Because violence, no matter how contained in the moment, does not remain hidden indefinitely. It leaves traces. It alters spaces. It creates a silence that eventually demands to be broken. What happened inside the Bain house on that morning was not a single event, but a series of connected moments, each one carrying its own weight, its own unanswered questions. The lack of a clear, uncontested sequence is not a failure of investigation, but a reflection of the complexity of the event itself. There are no witnesses to speak for those moments. No definitive account that can settle every uncertainty. Only the physical evidence, the reconstructed timelines, the interpretations that shift depending on how those pieces are arranged. And within that uncertainty lies the core of the mystery. Because the violence itself, as devastating as it was, is only part of the story. The other part is understanding how it could happen in that place, to those people, in that way. Understanding not just the actions, but the intent behind them. And that is something that the sequence of events alone cannot fully reveal. By the time the first officers stepped fully into the Bain house, the story had already begun to split into two separate realities. One existed in the voice of the young man outside, the one who had made the call, who insisted he had just come home to something unimaginable. The other existed inside the walls, in the stillness of the rooms, in the positions of objects and bodies that told a story without words. From that moment on, everything would depend on how those two realities aligned or failed to. The initial sweep of the house was not about theory. It was about control, about ensuring there was no immediate threat, about confirming what had already been feared the moment the call came through. Room by room, the officers moved carefully, their presence cautious but purposeful. What they encountered was not chaos in the way one might expect from a sudden, explosive act of violence. Instead, it was something more contained, more structured, almost as if each room held a separate scene rather than fragments of a single uncontrolled event. Each discovery added weight, but also confusion. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows did not suggest intrusion. The house did not bear the marks of someone breaking in from the outside. That detail alone began to narrow the possibilities, even before any deeper analysis took place. It suggested that whoever had carried out the act had either been allowed inside or had never needed permission to be there in the first place. The weapon, a rifle belonging to the household, reinforced that impression. It had not been brought in from elsewhere. It was part of the environment, something familiar, something accessible. Its presence connected the act directly to the house itself, to the people who lived within it. This was not an attack from an unknown external force. It was something that had emerged from within the boundaries of that space. As the initial shock settled into a more methodical process, forensic teams began their work. Every surface became significant. Every mark, every disturbance, every detail that might otherwise be overlooked was examined with care. The house transformed from a place of living into a place of analysis, where nothing was too small to matter. Footprints were among the first elements to draw attention. Not because they immediately revealed a clear answer, but because they complicated the picture. There were patterns, overlaps, traces that seemed to move through different parts of the house. Some aligned with expected movement, others raised questions. The interpretation of those patterns would later become a point of contention, with different readings suggesting different sequences of events. What seemed at first like a straightforward piece of evidence quickly revealed itself to be more ambiguous. Fingerprints told a similar story. The presence of David's prints in various parts of the house was not, on its own, surprising. It was his home. He lived there. Of course his prints would be present. But context matters. Location matters. Timing matters. When those prints were considered in relation to the positions of other elements in the scene, they began to take on a different significance. Not conclusive, not definitive, but enough to raise questions about movement, about presence, about what had happened in the critical window of time. The computer became a focal point early in the investigation. It sat there in the house, an object that did not belong to the immediate physical sequence of violence, and yet was undeniably part of the timeline. It had been turned on. A file had been accessed. A message existed. These were not passive details. They suggested action, intention, a moment where someone had interacted with something beyond the immediate environment. The timing of that interaction was crucial. Investigators began to examine when the computer had been used in relation to the estimated time of death for the victims. This required careful analysis, an attempt to align digital evidence with physical evidence, to see if they could form a coherent sequence. But like many aspects of the case, the results were not entirely clear. There were interpretations, possibilities, but no single, uncontested conclusion. The message itself added another layer of complexity. It was brief, but its implications were significant. It suggested awareness, reflection, perhaps even justification. But it also raised the possibility of staging, of an attempt to shape the narrative that would follow. Determining which of those interpretations was more accurate would become one of the central challenges of the investigation. In the rooms where the victims were found, details began to emerge that spoke to the nature of their final moments. Some areas showed signs of disturbance, subtle indications that there had been movement, resistance, an attempt to respond. Other areas were more still, suggesting a different kind of encounter. These variations mattered. They suggested that the sequence of events was not uniform, that each moment carried its own dynamics. Investigators worked to establish a timeline, to determine the order in which events had occurred. This involved not just the physical evidence, but also external factors. The time of the call. The estimated duration of David's paper route. Witness statements from people who might have seen him that morning. Each piece of information was placed into the developing framework, tested against the others to see if it held. But the timeline resisted simplicity. There were gaps, uncertainties, points where the available evidence could support more than one interpretation. The window of time between David leaving the house and returning to it became particularly important. Was it sufficient for the sequence of events that had taken place? Did it align with the physical evidence? Could it be reconciled with the digital evidence from the computer? These questions did not yield easy answers. As the investigation progressed, attention began to focus more directly on David himself. Not because there was a single piece of evidence that clearly implicated him, but because of the accumulation of details that, taken together, created a sense of inconsistency. His account of the morning was examined closely. The route he described, the timing he provided, the actions he claimed to have taken upon returning home. Small discrepancies began to appear. Not dramatic contradictions, but subtle differences between what he said and what the evidence seemed to suggest. The kind of differences that might be explained by stress, by confusion, by the impact of discovering something traumatic. But also the kind that, in a different light, might suggest something else entirely. His behavior at the scene was also noted. The way he spoke, the way he moved, the emotional tone of his responses. These observations are inherently subjective, influenced by perception, by expectation, by the context in which they are made. But they still became part of the overall picture, part of the set of factors that investigators considered as they tried to understand what had happened. There was also the question of the rifle. Its ownership, its location, its use. How it had been accessed. Who had handled it. Whether its presence in the sequence of events aligned more naturally with one narrative than another. These questions were explored in detail, with forensic analysis attempting to determine patterns that might indicate how it had been used during the incident. The absence of clear signs of an external intruder continued to weigh heavily on the investigation. Without evidence of forced entry, without indications that someone had come in from outside, the focus remained within the household. This did not eliminate all other possibilities, but it significantly narrowed the field. As the days passed, the house itself began to change in meaning. What had once been a private space became a site of public interest, a focal point for media attention, speculation, and debate. The details uncovered by investigators did not remain confined to official reports. They began to circulate, to be discussed, interpreted, questioned by people far removed from the scene itself. And with each new detail that emerged, the sense of clarity did not increase. It fractured. Different interpretations began to take shape, each one drawing on the same set of facts but arranging them in different ways. Some saw a pattern that pointed toward David, a sequence that could be understood as deliberate, constructed, consistent with the evidence when viewed from a particular angle. Others saw inconsistencies, gaps, elements that did not fit neatly into that narrative, suggesting the possibility of a different explanation. The investigation, at this stage, was not just about collecting evidence. It was about making sense of it. About determining which details mattered most, which interpretations held the most weight, which narrative could best account for the totality of what had been found inside that house. But the more the investigators looked, the more they realized that this was not a case that would resolve itself easily. The evidence did not point in a single, undeniable direction. It pointed in several. And each direction led to a different version of the truth. The discovery phase of the case did not bring immediate clarity. Instead, it revealed the complexity that would define everything that followed. It showed that what had happened inside the Bain house was not just an act of violence, but a puzzle, one composed of pieces that did not fit together cleanly, one that would require not just investigation, but interpretation. And interpretation, in cases like this, is where certainty begins to slip. Where doubt takes hold. Where the line between what is known and what is believed becomes increasingly difficult to define. Once the house had been processed, catalogued, and slowly emptied of the people in white suits who had turned every surface into evidence, the investigation entered a different phase. The silence inside those walls no longer held just the aftermath of violence, it now carried the weight of interpretation. Every detail collected had to be placed somewhere within a narrative, and the question was no longer simply what happened, but who could have made it happen. At the center of that question stood David Bain. In the early days, the focus on him was not immediate accusation but gravitational inevitability. He was the only one alive. He was the one who called. He was the one who had a timeline that overlapped precisely with the estimated window in which the killings occurred. Even without any other evidence, that alone would have drawn attention. But there was more than that. There were inconsistencies, subtle but persistent, that began to accumulate around his account of the morning. Investigators began to reconstruct his movements with increasing precision. The paper route, something so routine and mundane, became a critical framework. Each street he claimed to have visited, each delivery he said he had made, was checked against potential witnesses, against the expected timing, against any detail that could either confirm or contradict his version. Some parts aligned. Others felt less certain. There were gaps where no one could place him with confidence, stretches of time that existed without external verification. Those gaps became important. Because in a case where minutes mattered, where the sequence of events inside the house depended on a relatively narrow window, any uncertainty in his timeline could not be ignored. It didn't prove anything on its own, but it created space for doubt, and doubt, in an investigation, is often where suspicion begins to take root. His behavior in the aftermath was also examined with increasing scrutiny. Investigators and later observers would return again and again to the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the emotional tone of his responses. There were those who saw genuine shock, the disorientation of someone who had encountered something beyond comprehension. And there were those who saw something else, a disconnect, a lack of alignment between what he was saying and how he appeared. These interpretations were not uniform. They depended on perspective, on expectation, on the lens through which his actions were viewed. But they added to the growing sense that his role in the story was not as straightforward as it might have first appeared. At the same time, the evidence inside the house continued to be analyzed, reanalyzed, and debated. The footprints, the fingerprints, the positioning of objects, the sequence suggested by the distribution of events across different rooms, all of it was examined not just in isolation, but in relation to David's account. Could his version of events accommodate these details? Did it align naturally, or did it require adjustments, explanations that stretched beyond what seemed reasonable? The computer remained a focal point of this analysis. The timing of its use, the existence of the message, the implications of someone interacting with it during or after the sequence of violence, all of it pointed toward a moment that did not easily fit into a narrative of simple discovery. If David had returned home and immediately encountered the aftermath, why was the computer involved before the call was made? If the message had been created by someone else, when had that happened, and under what circumstances? These questions did not have clear answers, but they increasingly pointed investigators in a particular direction. And yet, even as the case against David began to take shape, it was not without complications. Because the more closely the evidence was examined, the more it revealed its own ambiguities. There were elements that seemed to support the idea of his involvement, but there were also elements that resisted it, details that did not fit neatly into a single, coherent narrative. This is where alternative possibilities began to emerge. One of the most significant centered on Robin Bain. The idea that the father might have been responsible introduced a completely different interpretation of the same set of facts. It suggested a sequence in which the violence originated not from the surviving son, but from the head of the household, a man who had access to the weapon, who lived within the same space, who might have had his own internal struggles that were not fully visible to others. There were aspects of Robin's life that, when viewed through this lens, took on new significance. Reports of emotional strain, of possible depression, of a man who may have been under pressure in ways that were not fully understood. These details did not prove anything, but they created a framework within which an alternative narrative could exist. In that narrative, the sequence of events inside the house would unfold differently. The movement from room to room, the encounters with each family member, the final positioning of the weapon, all of it would be reinterpreted through the idea that the violence began with Robin, not David. But this theory also faced challenges. The physical evidence did not clearly confirm it. In some cases, it seemed to align. In others, it raised further questions. The interpretation of that evidence became a matter of perspective, of which details were given more weight, which inconsistencies were considered significant, which could be explained and which could not. As the investigation continued, these competing narratives began to solidify. On one side, a case built around David Bain, supported by his proximity to the events, the questions surrounding his timeline, the details that seemed to suggest his involvement in the sequence of actions inside the house. On the other, a theory that shifted the focus to Robin Bain, suggesting that the violence originated from a different source, that the surviving son was not the perpetrator but the one who arrived too late to prevent what had already happened. Between these two positions lay a space filled with uncertainty. Investigators had to navigate that space carefully, weighing evidence that did not always point in the same direction, making decisions about what to prioritize, what to consider definitive, what to treat as ambiguous. It was not simply a matter of collecting facts, but of interpreting them, of constructing a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. There were also moments in the investigation where leads extended outward, beyond the immediate family. The possibility of an external intruder, while diminished by the lack of forced entry, was not entirely dismissed in the earliest stages. Investigators considered whether someone could have entered the house without leaving obvious signs, whether there could be a connection to anyone outside the household who might have had motive or opportunity. But these lines of inquiry did not develop into strong alternatives. They lacked the supporting evidence that would be necessary to sustain them. Gradually, the focus returned inward, to the people who lived in the house, to the relationships and dynamics that existed there. As the case developed, public attention began to intensify. The details that emerged from the investigation did not remain confined to official channels. They were discussed, debated, analyzed by people far removed from the scene itself. Opinions began to form, often strongly, about what had happened, about who was responsible, about which narrative made the most sense. And those opinions did not align. Some saw the case as clear, the evidence pointing in a direction that, once accepted, made the rest of the details fall into place. Others saw it as deeply flawed, a situation where the interpretation of evidence had been shaped by early assumptions, where alternative possibilities had not been fully explored or given equal weight. This division was not just a matter of public perception. It existed within the interpretation of the evidence itself. The same details could be read in different ways, leading to different conclusions depending on how they were arranged, how they were understood in relation to one another. The investigation, rather than narrowing the field of possibilities to a single, undeniable conclusion, seemed to expand the complexity of the case. Each answer led to new questions. Each piece of evidence, instead of closing off alternatives, sometimes opened new ones. And at the center of it all remained the same fundamental uncertainty. What had happened inside that house was not in doubt. But who had made it happen, and how exactly it had unfolded, remained deeply contested. As the case moved closer to the courtroom, the role of the investigation shifted once again. It was no longer just about discovering facts. It was about presenting them, organizing them into a narrative that could be understood, that could be argued, that could ultimately be judged. And in that process, the ambiguities that had defined the investigation would not disappear. They would become the battleground. The case did not break all at once. It didn't arrive as a single revelation that suddenly clarified everything that had come before. Instead, the breakthrough emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, shaped not by one decisive piece of evidence but by the accumulation of pressure placed on the existing narrative until it began to shift under its own weight. In the years following the initial conviction, the story seemed, at least on the surface, settled. A jury had listened to the evidence, weighed the arguments, and reached a conclusion. David Bain had been found guilty. The framework constructed by the prosecution had held long enough to carry that verdict. For many, that should have been the end of it. But some cases do not end when a verdict is delivered. They linger. They resist closure. And this was one of them. Questions continued to surface, not in dramatic bursts, but in persistent, methodical ways. Small inconsistencies that had been noted during the investigation did not disappear. Instead, they were revisited, examined again with fresh eyes, sometimes by people outside the original investigative process. Legal teams, independent analysts, journalists, and experts began to look at the case not as a finished story, but as one that might still be incomplete. The breakthrough began not with a new discovery, but with a re-examination. The evidence had always been there. The footprints, the fingerprints, the computer records, the positioning of the bodies, the estimated timelines. None of it was new. What changed was the way it was interpreted, the willingness to question the assumptions that had guided the original investigation. One of the central elements in this shift was the timeline. Time had always been critical in this case. The window between David leaving the house for his paper route and returning to make the call to police was narrow but not fixed. It depended on estimates, on reconstructions, on assumptions about how long certain actions would take. In the original trial, that timeline had been presented in a way that allowed for the possibility that David could have carried out the sequence of events. But what if those assumptions were not as solid as they appeared? What if the timeline, when examined more closely, revealed gaps that were larger than initially believed? Experts began to revisit the sequence of events with a more critical approach. They looked at the physical evidence in relation to the timing, asking whether the proposed sequence aligned with what was realistically possible. Could the actions attributed to David fit within the available window without contradiction? Did the order of events suggested by the evidence make sense when placed against the known movements of that morning? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they began to introduce doubt into what had once seemed more certain. The computer evidence became another focal point in this re-examination. At the heart of it was the question of when the message had been created and by whom. In the original narrative, this detail had been interpreted in a way that supported the prosecution's case. But as the evidence was revisited, alternative interpretations began to emerge. The exact timing of the computer's use, the sequence of actions required to produce the message, the context in which it was created, all of it was reconsidered. Could the message have been written earlier than initially believed? Could it have been created by someone other than David? If so, what did that imply about the sequence of events inside the house? These questions did not overturn the existing narrative on their own, but they weakened its foundation. They introduced uncertainty where there had once been a sense of coherence. The physical evidence inside the house also came under renewed scrutiny. The distribution of events across different rooms, the indications of movement, the signs of struggle in some areas but not others, all of it was reanalyzed. Investigators and experts began to consider whether the original interpretation had been influenced by an early assumption about who was responsible. If the investigation had started with the idea that David was the likely perpetrator, had that shaped the way the evidence was understood? This line of thinking opened the door to an alternative perspective. What if the sequence of events made more sense when viewed from a different starting point? What if the evidence, when arranged without the initial assumption, pointed in another direction? This is where the focus returned, with increasing intensity, to Robin Bain. The idea that the father could have been responsible was not new, but it gained new traction as the weaknesses in the original narrative became more apparent. The same details that had once been interpreted in one way were now being viewed through a different lens. Robin's state of mind became a central consideration. Reports of emotional strain, of possible depression, of a man who may have been under significant pressure, were re-examined not as peripheral details, but as potential indicators of motive. The absence of forced entry, the use of a household weapon, the movement through the house, all of these elements could be reinterpreted within a framework where the violence originated from within the parental figure. But again, this was not a simple reversal. The alternative narrative had to contend with the same complexities as the original. The physical evidence did not align perfectly with any single explanation. There were elements that supported the idea, and others that raised new questions. What began to emerge was not a clear answer, but a shift in balance. Where once the case against David had seemed strong enough to secure a conviction, it now appeared less certain. The confidence that had underpinned the original verdict began to erode, replaced by a growing recognition that the evidence might not be as definitive as it had been presented. This shift did not happen in isolation. It was driven by sustained effort, by legal appeals, by the work of those who believed that the case had not been properly resolved. Over time, these efforts built momentum, leading to the decision to revisit the case in a formal setting. The retrial would become the stage where this breakthrough was fully realized. But the breakthrough itself was not the retrial. It was the change in perspective that made the retrial possible. The recognition that the case, as it had been originally presented, contained enough uncertainty to justify a second look. The understanding that the narrative was not fixed, that it could be challenged, reinterpreted, reconstructed. And perhaps most importantly, the acceptance that in a case built on complex and sometimes ambiguous evidence, certainty could not be assumed simply because a conclusion had once been reached. By the time the retrial approached, the case had transformed. It was no longer a straightforward prosecution of a single suspect based on a set of interpreted facts. It had become a contested space, where two competing narratives stood side by side, each drawing on the same evidence, each offering a different explanation for what had happened inside that house. The breakthrough was not about proving one of those narratives beyond all doubt. It was about demonstrating that the doubt itself was significant. Significant enough to challenge a conviction. Significant enough to reopen a case that many had considered closed. Significant enough to force a re-examination not just of the evidence, but of the way that evidence had been understood from the very beginning. And in that sense, the breakthrough did not resolve the mystery. It deepened it. Because once certainty is replaced by doubt, the path forward does not become clearer. It becomes more complicated, more uncertain, more dependent on interpretation than ever before. The stage was now set for a confrontation, not just between prosecution and defense, but between two fundamentally different ways of seeing the same story. And in that confrontation, the question would no longer be simply what happened. It would be whether anyone could truly prove it. By the time the case reached the courtroom again in 2009, it no longer resembled the version that had first been presented to the public years earlier. The certainty that once surrounded it had thinned into something more fragile, more contested, as if the story itself had been slowly pulled apart and reassembled in different configurations depending on who was telling it. What remained was not a single narrative but two competing interpretations of the same tragedy, each one built from the same physical evidence, yet each leading to a completely different conclusion about responsibility. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere carried that tension from the very beginning. This was not a new case in the traditional sense. It was a return to something already judged, already decided, and yet now open again to scrutiny. The weight of that contradiction shaped everything that followed. Every statement, every piece of evidence, every argument carried the awareness that this was not simply about establishing facts, but about questioning whether those facts had ever been properly understood. The prosecution maintained a position rooted in the original interpretation of the evidence. Their case focused on the timeline, the physical evidence inside the house, and the behavior attributed to David Bain on the morning of the killings. They argued that the sequence of events, when viewed as a whole, still pointed toward his involvement. The paper route, the timing of the return to the house, the use of the computer, the positioning of the bodies, all of these elements were presented as pieces of a coherent narrative. In their view, the gaps and inconsistencies that had been raised over the years did not fundamentally undermine that narrative. They were variations within an overall structure that still held. But the defense approached the case from a different angle entirely. Their argument was not simply that the original interpretation was wrong, but that it had been shaped by assumptions that needed to be reconsidered. They challenged the reliability of the timeline, questioning whether the reconstruction of David's movements was as precise as it had been presented. They scrutinized the forensic evidence, suggesting that some of its interpretations were not as definitive as once believed. And most significantly, they introduced an alternative framework for understanding the events inside the house, one in which the father, Robin Bain, became a central figure in the sequence of violence. This alternative narrative was not presented lightly. It required the courtroom to reimagine the entire structure of the morning, to consider a scenario in which the origin of the violence lay not with the surviving son but with the father of the household. In this version of events, Robin Bain's emotional and psychological state became a key factor. The defense pointed to signs of distress, to indications of instability that, while not conclusive on their own, formed part of a broader picture. They suggested that the violence could have originated from within him, unfolding in a way that explained the positioning of the victims, the use of the firearm, and the final scene discovered by police. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a space where two different realities coexisted uneasily. Each side presented experts, analyses, and interpretations that often contradicted each other, not in the facts themselves, but in the meaning assigned to those facts. The same footprint could be read as evidence of presence or as incidental. The same computer activity could be interpreted as incriminating or ambiguous. The same timeline could be considered tight but possible, or too uncertain to rely upon. The jury was asked to navigate this landscape of uncertainty, to weigh not just evidence but interpretation, to determine which narrative was more consistent with the totality of what was known. It was not a process of simple accumulation, where one side clearly outnumbered the other in facts. Instead, it became an exercise in judgment, in deciding how much weight to give to ambiguity, how to interpret gaps, how to respond to the presence of reasonable doubt. David Bain himself was present throughout this process, but his presence was marked by a kind of stillness. He listened as his life, his actions, and his family were dissected and reconstructed in front of him. The person at the center of the case was no longer just a figure in an investigation. He had become the focal point of a broader struggle over meaning, responsibility, and truth. Every detail of his behavior was observed, not just for what it revealed about the past, but for what it might suggest about his credibility in the present. As witnesses were called and experts debated, the courtroom revealed something that had been present in the case from the beginning but had become more visible over time. The evidence itself did not speak with a single voice. It required interpretation at every stage. And interpretation, unlike fact, is shaped by perspective, by context, by the assumptions brought into the analysis. This became especially clear when forensic evidence was discussed. The positioning of bodies, the distribution of blood evidence, the sequence of events inferred from physical traces, all of these were presented with a level of scientific authority. But even within that authority, there was room for disagreement. Different experts arrived at different conclusions based on the same material. Some saw patterns that supported one narrative, while others saw inconsistencies that supported another. The computer evidence, once again, became a focal point of debate. The timing of the message, its content, and its relationship to the rest of the timeline were all examined in detail. The question was not simply whether the message existed, but what it meant in the context of the events. Was it a deliberate act of staging? Was it part of an attempt to construct a narrative after the fact? Or was it something more ambiguous, something that could not be cleanly categorized within either interpretation? As the trial moved forward, it became increasingly clear that the case was not just about reconstructing a sequence of events. It was about determining which interpretation of those events was more credible under conditions of uncertainty. The law required a verdict, but the evidence resisted simplicity. The defense's central argument gradually gained traction, not necessarily because it provided a perfect alternative explanation, but because it exposed weaknesses in the certainty of the original conviction. The idea that the prosecution's narrative relied on assumptions that were not as secure as once believed began to resonate within the courtroom. The possibility that those assumptions had shaped the interpretation of evidence became a critical point of reflection. When the time came for deliberation, the weight of the case rested heavily on the concept of reasonable doubt. Not certainty, not absolute proof, but doubt that was sufficient to challenge the reliability of the original verdict. It was this threshold that ultimately shaped the outcome. The jury returned with a decision that overturned the previous conviction. David Bain was acquitted. In that moment, the legal system formally acknowledged that the case against him had not met the standard required to sustain a conviction. The evidence, when reconsidered in its entirety, did not eliminate reasonable doubt. And in the absence of certainty, the law required a different outcome. The courtroom reaction was not unified. There was no single emotional response that defined the moment. Instead, there was a mixture of relief, confusion, disagreement, and unresolved tension. Because even though a verdict had been reached, the underlying questions that had shaped the case had not disappeared. The trial had provided an answer in legal terms, but it had not resolved the broader mystery of what had happened inside the Bain house on that morning in 1994. It had only redefined the boundaries of what could be said with confidence. And in doing so, it left behind something that would continue to persist beyond the courtroom. A space where certainty had once been expected, but where only interpretation remained. When the court finally fell silent after the verdict, it did not feel like an ending in the way people often expect from justice. There was no sense of a story being neatly closed, no emotional resolution that settled the questions that had built up over years. Instead, there was a different kind of silence, one shaped not by conclusion but by exhaustion, as if everyone present had reached the limits of how much uncertainty they could hold at once. Outside the courtroom, the world reacted in fragments. Some people saw the verdict as long overdue correction, a recognition that the original conviction had rested on unstable ground. Others saw it as a failure of accountability, a collapse of certainty in a case that had once seemed straightforward. These reactions did not reconcile with each other. They existed in parallel, each supported by its own reading of the same history, the same evidence, the same tragedy. But beyond the legal outcome, the deeper weight of the case remained unchanged. 5 members of a family were still gone. That fact did not shift. It did not become more explainable or less painful depending on the verdict. It remained fixed, resistant to reinterpretation, sitting beneath every argument and every analysis like something untouched by the passage of time or the evolution of legal reasoning. In the years that followed, the Bain case became something larger than the events of that single morning. It transformed into a point of reference in discussions about justice, about investigation, about the limits of certainty in forensic reconstruction. It was studied not only for what happened, but for how it was understood, how interpretations shifted over time, how evidence that once seemed clear could later be seen differently when placed under a different light. For David Bain, the acquittal brought legal closure but not narrative closure. Even after being declared not guilty, he remained within the orbit of the case, still defined by it in the eyes of many. His life could not fully separate from the events of 1994, because those events had already been absorbed into public consciousness in a way that extended beyond the courtroom. Once a person becomes central to a case of that scale, the separation between individual and narrative becomes difficult to restore. And yet, even as attention continued to circle around him, the fundamental question at the heart of the case remained unresolved in a deeper sense. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but the story itself had not yielded a single, universally accepted truth. Instead, it had produced competing versions, each supported by evidence, each challenged by alternative interpretations. One version held that David Bain was wrongly convicted, that the original investigation had misinterpreted key evidence, that assumptions had been made too early and carried too far into the construction of guilt. In this view, the retrial represented a necessary correction, a recognition that justice had initially failed to meet its own standards. Another version continued to see unresolved inconsistencies in the evidence, areas where doubt remained not only about the original conviction but also about the alternative explanations. In this perspective, the case did not resolve into innocence or guilt with clarity, but remained suspended in a space where certainty was difficult to establish in either direction. Between these interpretations, there is no final point of convergence. That is part of what makes the Bain case endure. It does not settle into a single, stable narrative that satisfies all perspectives. Instead, it continues to exist as a structure of competing readings, where each attempt at explanation introduces new questions alongside potential answers. The house itself, long since emptied of its role in the public imagination, remains a physical location in Dunedin, but its meaning has changed permanently. It is no longer just a domestic space. It has become a symbol, layered with interpretations that extend far beyond its physical boundaries. For those who studied the case, it represents the limits of reconstruction, the difficulty of translating physical evidence into definitive narrative when human behavior, timing, and perception all intersect in complex ways. What happened inside that house on the 20th of June, 1994 is not in question at the most basic level. 5 people died there under violent circumstances. That fact anchors the entire case. But everything beyond that point becomes a matter of interpretation, and interpretation, unlike fact, does not settle easily. It shifts depending on the framework applied to it. The investigation, the trials, the appeals, and the retrial all attempted to reduce that uncertainty, to draw a clear line through a complex set of events. But what emerged instead was a layered structure of understanding, where clarity in one area often introduced ambiguity in another. In reflecting on the case, what remains most striking is not only the violence itself, but the way in which meaning was constructed around it. How evidence can be read in different ways. How timelines can shift depending on assumptions. How the same physical reality can support multiple narratives that cannot all be true at the same time, yet each of which contains elements that resist easy dismissal. The Bain case ultimately does not offer a clean lesson. It does not resolve into a simple moral or procedural conclusion. Instead, it leaves behind a set of questions about how truth is established in complex investigations, how certainty is constructed in legal systems, and how fragile that certainty can become when re-examined under different conditions. And in that sense, the final reflection is not about deciding between competing narratives, but about recognizing the space that remains between them. A space where evidence exists, where interpretation operates, and where absolute clarity is not always available. That space is uncomfortable. It resists closure. It does not allow the story to end in a way that satisfies every perspective. But it is also where the reality of the case continues to exist. Not as a single story, but as a collection of possibilities, still shaped by the same morning, still anchored in the same house, still defined by the same irreversible loss that began everything. When a case like this reaches its final stage in the public imagination, people often expect clarity to arrive eventually, as if time itself will sort through the contradictions and leave behind a single, stable truth. But some cases do not behave that way. They do not resolve into certainty, even after trials, appeals, and years of analysis. Instead, they settle into something more uncomfortable, a kind of permanent tension between what is known, what is believed, and what can never be fully reconstructed. The Bain case is one of those rare stories that continues to exist in that unresolved space. What happened inside the house on that winter morning in Dunedin is not forgotten, nor is it in dispute at its most fundamental level. A family was destroyed. A young man survived. A community was forced to confront an act of violence that disrupted the quiet assumptions of everyday life. Those facts remain fixed. They do not change with time or interpretation. But everything built around those facts, the explanations, the responsibility, the sequence of cause and effect, has never fully stabilized. In the years since the final verdict, the case has become something more than a legal matter. It has become a reference point for discussions about how truth is constructed in criminal investigations, how evidence is interpreted under pressure, and how easily early assumptions can shape the direction of an entire narrative. It is studied not because it offers closure, but because it resists it. For those who look back at the case, there is a temptation to search for the missing piece, the detail that will finally align everything into a coherent picture. A timeline that resolves all contradictions. A piece of evidence that eliminates ambiguity. A reconstruction that satisfies every inconsistency. But the more deeply the case is examined, the more it becomes clear that no such single piece exists. Instead, there are layers. Physical evidence that can be interpreted in more than one way depending on context. Timelines that depend on estimates rather than exact measurements. Human behavior that can be read differently depending on perspective. And within those layers, competing narratives that each explain part of the story while leaving other parts unresolved. One narrative sees a wrongful conviction corrected through legal review, emphasizing the weaknesses in the original interpretation and the importance of revisiting evidence with fresh scrutiny. In this view, the system ultimately corrected itself, acknowledging that certainty had been reached too quickly and without sufficient consideration of alternative explanations. Another narrative does not fully settle into that conclusion. It focuses on the areas of ambiguity that remain even after retrial, the elements that do not align neatly with any single explanation. It points to the difficulty of reconstructing events with precision when so many variables are uncertain, and it resists the idea that the case can be fully closed in either direction. Between these perspectives, the truth does not fully resolve. It does not collapse into one version that eliminates all others. Instead, it remains distributed across interpretations, each one supported by some elements of the evidence, none of them able to account for everything without tension. This is not unusual in complex investigations, but the intensity of public attention in this case has made that ambiguity more visible, more persistent. Over time, the Bain case has become less about reaching a definitive answer and more about examining how such answers are constructed in the first place. It raises uncomfortable questions about certainty in forensic interpretation, about the weight given to early assumptions, about the difficulty of separating observation from inference. It shows how easily a narrative can take shape around a set of facts, and how difficult it can be to dismantle that narrative once it has formed, even when new interpretations emerge. For David Bain, the legal conclusion brought formal resolution, but not complete separation from the case itself. His name remains tied to the events of 1994, not only in legal records but in public memory. That connection is part of what makes the case endure, because it is no longer only about what happened, but about how those events are remembered, discussed, and reinterpreted over time. For the families, communities, and individuals connected to the case in different ways, the passage of time does not erase the impact. It changes its shape, but not its presence. The loss remains. The questions remain. The absence of a universally accepted explanation remains. And so the case continues to exist in a form that is neither active investigation nor fully closed history. It sits in a space between the two, revisited periodically, re-examined when new perspectives emerge, but never fully resolved into something final. That is perhaps the most important lesson it leaves behind. Not a conclusion about guilt or innocence in the simplest sense, but an understanding of how fragile certainty can be when built on incomplete information. How easily interpretations can diverge from shared facts. How complex it can be to reconstruct human events after the fact, especially when those events involve private spaces, internal relationships, and moments that were never fully witnessed. In the end, the Bain case does not offer closure in the way true crime stories are often expected to. It offers something less satisfying but more honest. A recognition that some events, even when heavily investigated and legally adjudicated, remain partially open to interpretation. The house on every street still exists, physically unchanged in its location in Dunedin, but its meaning has shifted permanently. It is no longer just a home where a family once lived. It is a place that has been overlaid with narrative, with analysis, with competing explanations that continue to coexist without full resolution. And perhaps that is where the story ultimately settles. Not in certainty. Not in a single version of truth. But in the space where multiple truths continue to exist at once, each shaped by the same events, each unable to fully eliminate the others. A space that remains open, even after the world has moved on. Even after all the analysis, the trials, and the passage of years, there is still a tendency to search for a final word on the Bain case, as if somewhere within its complexity there must exist a single explanation that ties everything together cleanly. But the deeper one looks into it, the more that expectation begins to fade. What remains instead is not resolution, but endurance. The case continues to exist not because it is unfinished in a procedural sense, but because it resists being fully contained by any one interpretation. In Dunedin, life has long since moved forward. Streets that once carried the weight of investigation now return to their ordinary rhythms. Houses change hands. People age. New stories replace old ones in the daily fabric of the city. Yet certain events do not fully dissolve into the background of time. They linger, not as active presence, but as embedded memory within a place. The Bain case is one of those events, still referenced, still examined, still discussed whenever questions of justice, evidence, and uncertainty arise. What makes it persist is not just the violence itself, but the way it was understood, reinterpreted, and argued over across decades. Few cases move through so many layers of legal and public examination while continuing to resist a unified conclusion. It is not unusual for criminal cases to generate disagreement, but it is less common for those disagreements to remain structurally intact even after retrial and appellate review. In this case,